Fog thickly blanketed the Alaskan village, muting sound and blurring the landscape. This small indigenous settlement, once ruled by ice, faced change as warming temperatures melted the sea ice. Yet today, the villagers gathered for a seasonal celebration, a brief moment of joy amid survival challenges. Families mingled, children played, and elders reflected quietly. The scent of food filled the cold air, symbolizing unity and tradition as they came together to honor their heritage and support one another in the shifting Arctic environment. Unbeknownst to them, something far more dangerous than any blizzard lurked beyond the edge of the fog. The polar bear, driven south by starvation, wandered in an increasingly unfamiliar environment. The sea ice, once the foundation of its hunting grounds, was disappearing, forcing it into closer proximity to human settlements. This particular bear had been stalking the periphery of the village for days, gaunt and desperate, its immense body weakened by hunger. It had smelled the food, sensed the warmth of life, and instinctively followed the scent through the fog. The bear's body was an embodiment of power, but power was diminished by need. Once thick and white, its fur clung to a skeletal frame, ribs visible beneath the matted fur. Yellowed eyes, filled with hunger and desperation, scanned the village from the shadows. The fog concealed its approach, as silent as the snow underfoot. It moved with a terrifying grace, its massive paws padding lightly as it neared the heart of the village. Suddenly, there was a shift. The bear stepped into the open, emerging from the mist like a phantom. At first, no one noticed. The gathering continued as children laughed and adults chatted. But then a gasp cut through the fog, and eyes turned toward the pale, hulking figure standing at the edge of the gathering. For a brief, surreal moment, the village was frozen, locked in a collective state of disbelief. It wasn't unusual to see polar bears in the Arctic, but never this close, never like this. The bear moved. It charged without warning, driven by an instinctual hunger that overpowered all caution. Its speed was shocking, belying its size and weakened condition. In an instant, the peaceful gathering turned into chaos. Screams erupted as the massive predator barreled forward, its powerful limbs propelling it toward the nearest group of villagers. A child, no older than 6, was caught in the bear's path. The predator's jaws, lined with dagger-like teeth, clamped down on the child's small frame with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across the snow, staining the pure white landscape a gruesome red. The bear's attack was swift and ruthless. It flung the child's lifeless body aside as if it weighed nothing and moved on to the next victim. Panic spread through the crowd like wildfire. People scrambled in all directions, some toward their homes, others trying in vain to help those already in the bear's path. Elders, their movement slowed by age, became easy targets. One of the village elders, a respected woman known for her wisdom, was caught off guard as she tried to shield a younger family member. The bear's massive paw swiped across her body, claws raking through her flesh as if she were made of paper. She collapsed in a heap, her body twisted and broken, lifeblood soaking into the ground beneath her. Another villager, a man in his 30s, grabbed a shovel from a nearby stack of tools. His face was etched with fear and determination as he ran toward the bear, swinging the makeshift weapon with all his strength. The shovel connected with the bear's side, but the impact was nothing more than a glancing blow. Enraged, the bear turned on him, its maw open wide. The man barely had time to react before the bear's jaws closed around his leg. It pulled him down, ripping into his flesh with savage efficiency. His screams echoed in the air, cut short by the bear's relentless mauling. In just 2 minutes, the polar bear had already claimed multiple lives, and the carnage was far from over. It moved with terrifying speed from one target to the next, its primal instincts honed from a life of survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Even weakened by hunger, its sheer strength was overwhelming. The bear swiped at another villager, tearing through clothing and flesh as it sent the man flying backward, landing in a crumpled heap. A group of villagers, in a desperate bid to defend their community, gathered whatever they could find, shovels, hammers, even kitchen knives, and charged at the bear. Their fear was palpable, but so was their determination. The bear met them with equal ferocity. It reared up on its hind legs, towering over them, a giant of muscle and bone. One villager stabbed at its belly with a knife, but the blade barely penetrated the thick fur and skin. The bear roared in fury and brought its total weight down on him, crushing his body beneath its bulk. Those who remained tried to flee. Parents scooped up their children, running toward the safety of their homes, but the bear was relentless. It charged at another group, its jaws snapping at anything that moved. A young girl, separated from her family in the chaos, found herself in the bear's direct path. She tried to run, but the bear's claws caught her leg, dragging her down into the snow. Her cries were lost amidst the frenzy as the bear tore into her. As the attack raged on, the village's isolation became painfully evident. No emergency services were close enough to respond in time. The nearest outpost was hours away by helicopter, and even that would be delayed by the fog and weather conditions. The villagers were alone, left to face the beast with nothing but their own courage and meager tools. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Eventually, through a combination of sheer willpower and luck, the remaining villagers managed to drive the bear back. Several men, wielding axes and other tools, landed blows that slowed the bear down. Bloodied and exhausted, the bear finally retreated into the fog, limping and growling, but it had already left its mark on the village. The aftermath was harrowing. Bodies lay strewn across the snow, their blood staining the earth. The survivors, trembling and in shock, surveyed the carnage. 9 people had been killed, including children and elders, their lives snuffed out in the blink of an eye. The village, once a place of tight-knit community and tradition, was now a scene of unspeakable horror. The morning sun had barely crested over the ridges of a park in the United States of America, casting long shadows across the landscape as a group of 5 hikers made their way along a narrow, winding trail. The sky above was a bright blue, and the towering trees flanked the path, giving the illusion of safety in the wilderness. Among the group were Caleb, the most experienced of the hikers, his cousin Owen, friends Sawyer and Garrett, and Maya, an avid nature enthusiast eager to capture the perfect photograph of the wild beauty around them. The trail they had chosen was less popular, weaving through steep ridges with abrupt drop-offs that tumbled into rocky ravines below. The sense of adventure heightened as they ascended higher, the path narrowing with each step. Overhead, birds occasionally called, and in the distance, the faint rush of a river echoed through the still air. As they rounded a sharp bend in the trail, a sudden rustling sound echoed from the dense brush ahead. Caleb signaled the group to halt, his senses alert. In the silence that followed, the source of the sound became painfully clear. A grizzly bear cub, no older than a few months, emerged from the bushes on the trail ahead of them. The cub, curious and unaware of the group, paused to sniff the air, its small frame adorably clumsy, but a stark reminder that where there was a cub, a mother was indeed not far behind. The hikers froze, their eyes wide with apprehension. Caleb, his heart now pounding, gestured for the group to slowly back away. But before they could make any headway, a heavy grunt came from behind them, echoing up the trail. There, from the direction they had just come, a massive female grizzly bear emerged, her fur bristling, and her dark eyes locking onto the hikers with deadly intent. She was much closer than the cub, and far more dangerous. The hikers now found themselves in an impossible situation. The mother grizzly stood behind them, her hulking figure blocking the only path down, while the cub was directly in front, its confused mewling drawing the mother closer. They were trapped, with cliffs dropping off on either side of the narrow trail and nowhere to flee without risking a fatal fall. The grizzly mother let out a deep, guttural growl, a clear sign of her growing agitation. She was torn between protecting her cub and eliminating what she saw as a threat. Her massive body shifted on the path, her claws scraping against the loose rock and dirt as she began to inch forward. The cub, hearing its mother, started to meander toward her, but the group stood in its way. Caleb motioned to retreat slowly, stepping backward inch by inch, but as the group complied, disaster struck. Garrett, who had been standing closest to the edge of the trail, placed his weight on a patch of loose rock. The ground beneath him gave way without warning, sending him tumbling toward the cliff edge. His arms flailed as he tried to catch himself, but the sudden movement startled the already tense grizzly. The mother bear charged. Her massive frame barreled forward with terrifying speed, closing the gap in mere seconds. Caleb's heart raced as he watched Garrett scramble to regain his footing. The sudden surge of movement from the bear sent loose rocks cascading down the cliffside, the sound of them crashing below adding to the chaos. The hikers were in a state of panic, their retreat faltering. The mother grizzly's powerful strides brought her terrifyingly close, her teeth bared and eyes wild with fury. Maya stumbled backward, her camera clattering to the ground, forgotten in the sheer terror of the moment. Garrett managed to stop his fall just as the bear reached the group. Her massive paw swiped through the air, narrowly missing him but striking Owen, who had been closest to Garrett, in an attempt to help him. Owen crumpled to the ground, gasping as the bear's claws raked across his torso, leaving deep gashes that immediately began to bleed. Sawyer, in his desperation to avoid the bear's attack, made a break for the cliffside, misjudging the distance. His foot slipped on the crumbling rocks, and he went down hard, his body skidding dangerously close to the edge. The sharp stones beneath him tore through his clothes and skin, but the proximity to the sheer drop kept him frozen in place, unable to move without risking falling to his death. Caleb, paralyzed by the sight of his friend's injuries, struggled to think. The bear, now fully committed to defending her cub, reared up on her hind legs, standing over 7 feet tall. She let out a roar that echoed through the canyon, her massive bulk casting a long shadow over the crumpled hikers below her. As the bear came down on all fours again, her eyes flicked toward Garrett, who was still scrambling to find solid ground. The movement caught her attention, and she charged again, her claws digging deep into the earth. Garrett, realizing too late that he was her next target, barely managed to roll to the side as the grizzly lunged, but his movements caused the cliff edge to give way beneath him. His body plunged downward, arms grasping at air as he fell, disappearing from view as the group helplessly watched. Owen, gasping for breath through the pain, tried to crawl away, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. Caleb, now fully realizing the hopelessness of the situation, frantically searched for a way to get the group out of this nightmare. The cub had wandered off the trail, and the mother bear, still enraged, was pacing back and forth, growling menacingly, her eyes darting between the remaining hikers. Maya, shaking with fear, pulled herself up from the dirt, only to see that Sawyer had slid even closer to the cliff's edge. His fingers clawed at the loose ground, desperately trying to find purchase. Caleb moved toward him, hoping to pull him back to safety, but the bear caught sight of the movement. With a terrifying roar, she lunged again. Caleb's heart raced as the grizzly charged straight at him. He could feel the ground trembling beneath her weight as she closed the distance. Just as she was about to reach him, Maya threw herself in the opposite direction, hoping to distract the bear. The grizzly hesitated for a split second, her attention shifting between Caleb and Maya before she finally turned toward her cub, now out of sight down the trail. The bear, sensing that her cub had wandered away, gave one final growl before retreating down the trail, her massive body vanishing into the underbrush. The hikers, bruised, bleeding, and terrified, could only stare at each other in disbelief, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. Caleb looked down the cliff where Garrett had fallen, the silence below unbearable. The group, though alive, was shattered. Their bond tested in the most harrowing of circumstances. The wilderness had brutally reminded them that in Yellowstone, nature held the ultimate power. The Anderson family had eagerly anticipated their mountain getaway, hoping to escape their hectic lives and reconnect with nature. John and Lisa, along with their children, Noah, 14, and Emily, 10, rented a secluded cabin deep in the wilderness. Nestled among towering pines and overlooking a pristine lake, it offered a perfect retreat. The remoteness provided a welcome change from city life. No cell service, no distractions, just the sounds of nature. The first few days unfolded beautifully. Long hikes, marshmallow roasting, and nights spent under a starlit sky. But on the third night, a strange stillness fell over the forest. John sensed something was off as they retreated into the cabin after an evening by the fire. The usual sounds of the woods faded, creating an unsettling silence. Though rustic, the cabin felt sturdy, constructed from thick logs and heavy beams, yet they hadn't fully prepared for the local black bears, notorious for scavenging human food. The park ranger had warned them, but John was confident they had secured their supplies. As the family settled into bed, a massive male bear began to circle the cabin, drawn in by the scent of their food. The faint scratching at the door went unnoticed until it intensified into a loud pounding. John jolted awake around midnight, initially dismissing it as a tree branch. But as the thuds grew louder, dread filled him. He jumped from the bed, heart racing, while Lisa stirred beside him, sensing his alarm. Cracking the door open, John was met with the unmistakable sound of claws scraping against wood and a massive shadow outside. The bear was at the front door, battering against it with powerful limbs. Panic surged as John realized they were trapped inside. The cabin was sturdy but not impenetrable. If the bear broke through, there would be no stopping it. He turned to Lisa, now fully awake, her eyes wide with fear. The kids were in the other room, vulnerable and unaware of the looming danger. Time was running out, and the bear was determined to get in. A loud crack echoed through the cabin as the doorframe splintered. The bear, driven by hunger and the scent of food, broke through with alarming speed. Its head and massive shoulders squeezed through the opening, and in the dim light of the cabin, its dark eyes gleamed with determination. John's instincts kicked in. He needed to reach the children. But the bear was now entirely inside the main room, and the lumbering animal blocked the hallway leading to the kids' bedroom. Lisa grabbed his arm, her face pale. He could feel her trembling. The bear began sniffing the air, drawn toward the kitchen where the family's food was stored. For a brief moment, it seemed to be the scent of food, which allowed John and Lisa time to think. But the car keys were in the kitchen, hanging on a hook just above the counter where they'd left a loaf of bread out earlier. Their only chance of escape was getting those keys and making it to the car, parked just outside. They were pinned. With the bear's bulk blocking the main room, John motioned for Lisa to stay put, as he frantically scanned the room for something, anything that could help them. His eyes landed on an old hunting rifle mounted on the wall. He darted across the room, but as he grabbed the gun, his stomach sank. No ammunition. The bear, having torn into a cabinet, sent pans crashing to the floor. It growled a low, deep sound that rattled the walls. Noah and Emily's room was on the opposite side of the cabin, and they were still trapped inside. John knew that if the bear became too aggressive, it could easily tear through the doors to reach them. He edged closer to the hallway, trying to remain out of the bear's line of sight. The animal was preoccupied with its focus on rummaging through the kitchen, but any sudden movement or sound could draw its attention. He made it halfway down the hall when the bear suddenly jerked its head up, its sharp ears picking up on the creaking of the floorboards. It sniffed the air again, turning toward the hallway. John froze, every muscle in his body tense. The bear moved slowly in his direction, its heavy steps echoing off the wooden floor. Lisa, still near the bedroom, looked on helplessly. The bear's massive body shifted its attention entirely toward John now. With no place to run, John backed toward the kids' room, hoping to shield them from the impending danger. In a split-second decision, John flung a chair across the room, hoping to divert the bear's attention. The chair crashed against the wall, causing the bear to snarl and charge toward the noise. It swiped at the air, its powerful claws tearing through the fabric of the furniture. In the chaos, John managed to reach Noah and Emily's room. He shoved the door open, pulling the kids from their beds. They were groggy, but quickly understood the severity of the situation. With the bear still distracted in the main room, John motioned for them to be silent. There was no time to think about a complete escape plan, only survival. Lisa, seizing the moment, grabbed the car keys while the bear tore through the remnants of the kitchen. With John leading the kids and Lisa trailing closely behind, they moved as quietly as possible through the back hallway toward the side door. Suddenly, the bear let out an ear-splitting roar. It had realized its human prey was trying to escape. It charged toward them, its claws scraping the floorboards, tearing through the house in a frantic rush. John shoved the side door open just in time. They all stumbled out into the cold night air, sprinting toward the car parked just a few feet away. The bear slammed into the doorframe behind them, but by then, they were already inside the car. Lisa jammed the keys into the ignition, hands shaking uncontrollably as she started the engine. With a roar of the engine, they sped down the dirt road, leaving the cabin and the enraged bear behind in the darkness. As the cabin disappeared in the rearview mirror, they knew that they had narrowly escaped a brutal encounter, but the image of the bear breaking into their peaceful sanctuary would haunt them long after the mountain retreat was over. The sun rose over the zoo, casting long shadows across the enclosures. Frank Mulligan, a seasoned veteran of over 30 years, walked his familiar route one last time, filled with memories of the animals he had cared for. Today marked his retirement, a bittersweet milestone. Beside him was Sam, an enthusiastic rookie eager to learn the ropes. Sam's energy was infectious as he peppered Frank with questions about the animals and zoo operations. Frank, patient yet measured, offered advice, allowing Sam to observe and learn. Their dynamic was evident. Frank's cautious experience contrasted sharply with Sam's reckless enthusiasm. As they approached the brown bear enclosure, Frank's gaze fell on Kodiak, the zoo's largest bear, a hulking presence he had cared for since cubhood. Frank respected Kodiak's moods, always mindful of the bear's potential danger. Sam, however, had little direct interaction with Kodiak and was about to witness the bear management process for the first time. But as they neared the entrance, Frank noticed a maintenance panel ajar, its bolts loosened, likely overlooked by a careless worker. Unease gripped him as he realized the danger. This panel provided access to a service gate, the only barrier between Kodiak and freedom. In an instant, Kodiak sensed the opportunity. Frank's heart raced as he watched the bear grip the loose gate with its powerful paw and tug it open. Before either man could react, Kodiak slipped through, emerging into the zoo's public area. Panic erupted as the first visitors spotted the massive bear. Screams filled the air, and chaos ensued as people scattered in all directions, fleeing from the predator now roaming freely. Frank's heart pounded in his chest as he assessed the situation. This was no longer about preventing an escape. It was now a race to stop a catastrophe. Kodiak, disoriented by the sudden freedom, was unpredictable and dangerous. Frank knew what the bear was capable of, and with frightened visitors running chaotically, the potential for disaster was immense. Sam, his voice trembling, pointed to a tranquilizer gun mounted on a nearby wall. Frank shook his head, knowing it wasn't a quick fix. The tranquilizers would take too long to subdue an animal of Kodiak's size, and firing in a crowded area could only make the situation worse. This would have to be handled up close, carefully, and with precision. Frank's mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan. He knew Kodiak's habits. If they could guide him back toward the enclosure, they might have a chance. But Sam had other ideas. The rookie's impulse was to chase the bear, attempting to corner it using vehicles and barriers. Frank, though, knew that chasing Kodiak would only escalate the bear's aggression. As Sam darted off to execute his plan, Frank felt a surge of frustration. The young keeper's inexperience was driving him into dangerous decisions. Frank stayed back, using his knowledge of Kodiak to keep the bear in sight but at a safe distance, hoping to steer the massive creature without provoking a confrontation. However, Sam's risky approach quickly backfired. A group of zoo workers attempted to block Kodiak's path using a small utility vehicle. The bear, feeling trapped, reacted with terrifying speed. With a guttural roar, he charged the car, flipping it effortlessly. The workers fled, leaving the vehicle a crumpled heap. Kodiak, now agitated, reared up on his hind legs, towering over the scene, his claws slashing at the air. Frank knew they were losing control. Kodiak's aggression was escalating rapidly, and if they didn't intervene quickly, someone would be seriously hurt or worse. He abandoned his cautious distance and moved in closer, heart pounding, knowing this was a critical moment. Kodiak turned toward a cluster of fleeing visitors. Frank could see the fear in their faces, and his instincts took over. With no other options, he grabbed a metal rod from a nearby supply shed and waved it in the air, making himself as large and intimidating as possible. Kodiak's attention shifted, his beady eyes locking onto Frank. It was a calculated risk. Frank knew the bear recognized him, but no guarantee would stop an attack. For a moment, Kodiak hesitated. The bear, now only a few yards away, growled deeply, his massive paws leaving gouges in the earth as he tested Frank's resolve. The air between them was thick with tension, each second dragging on for what felt like an eternity. Frank stood his ground, unflinching as Kodiak sized him up. But the standoff couldn't last forever. Suddenly, Kodiak lunged forward, the ground shaking under his weight. Frank reacted, sidestepping the bear's charge just in time, the massive paw swiping inches from his body. The rod in Frank's hand was useless against the sheer power of the bear's movements. All he could do now was stay alive long enough for help to arrive. The bear wheeled around quicker than Frank had expected, and this time, there was no avoiding the collision. Kodiak struck with brutal force, sending Frank sprawling to the ground. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, but Frank managed to roll out of the way as Kodiak's claws came down again, gouging the dirt where Frank had just been. Desperation surged through Frank. He couldn't outrun the bear, and he certainly couldn't overpower it. But he could still outthink it. He grabbed a nearby bucket of fish meant for the polar bears and hurled it toward Kodiak. The sudden smell of food caught the bear's attention, and for a moment, Kodiak was distracted. It was all Frank needed. With adrenaline surging through him, Frank scrambled to his feet and used the few precious seconds to lead Kodiak back toward the enclosure. The bear followed, now more interested in the fish than the chaos around him. Frank's heart raced as they neared the gate, the plan coming together. As Kodiak entered the enclosure, Frank slammed the gate shut behind him, securing the bolts in place. He leaned against the fence, gasping for breath, his body trembling from the exertion and fear. Dr. Elena Rossi stood at the edge of the dense spruce forest, her breath steady but her heart racing. As a wildlife biologist with over a decade of experience studying bears, she was well acquainted with the challenges of the wilderness. Today, however, was different. Reports of an orphaned bear cub wandering near her research station had reached her, and the urgency to act was palpable. If she didn't intervene quickly, the cub would face starvation or predators. Equipped with her tranquilizer rifle and her expertise, Elena set off, her boots crunching on the forest floor as she searched for any signs of the cub. This area was known territory for a local mother bear and her offspring, but there was no sign of them. Time was critical, and the cub was alone and vulnerable. As she navigated the underbrush, the forest hummed with life. Birds chirped overhead and leaves rustled in the breeze. Then, through a break in the trees, she spotted it. The small cub lay curled near a fallen tree, weak and exposed. Its coat, typically thick and glossy, was matted, and it barely lifted its head as she approached. Elena's heart ached. This was the moment she had trained for countless times, yet it never got easier. Slowly kneeling, she readied her tranquilizer gun, intent on sedating the cub and bringing it back for care. Her movements were calm and precise as she adjusted the dart for the cub's small size, but just as she was about to aim, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the clearing. Every instinct in her body screamed danger. Elena froze, her heart racing. The growl intensified, and her blood ran cold as she turned her head. Emerging from the underbrush was the mother bear, massive and imposing, her dark fur gleaming in the sunlight. The bear sniffed the air, her dark eyes locking onto Elena and the cub. Elena's mind raced. The mother had been out of sight, likely foraging or patrolling her territory. But now, she saw Elena as a threat to her young. In an instant, the bear lunged forward with a deafening roar that shook the forest. Elena dropped the tranquilizer gun and scrambled backward, adrenaline surging. She recognized this wasn't a warning, it was a full-blown attack. The bear believed her cub was in danger. With no time to think, Elena threw herself to the side, narrowly avoiding a massive paw that swiped where she had just been. The bear was relentless. Panic surged in her, but she had to stay focused. She needed to create distance. Darting toward a cluster of trees, she relied on her understanding of bear behavior to navigate the terrain. Bears, though bulky, could sprint with surprising speed. The ground shook as the bear charged after her, its fury palpable. Elena's legs burned as she ran, branches whipping against her face and arms. She ducked behind a tree, hoping to buy herself some time. The bear skidded to a halt, sniffing the air, clearly agitated. Elena's heart raced as she formulated a plan. She needed to reach her research station, where safety awaited. But with the bear in pursuit, she had to act quickly. But then she tripped. Her foot caught on a root, sending her sprawling to the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of her, but there was no time to recover. The bear was upon her, and Elena barely rolled out of the way as the bear struck, her claws tearing into the ground where Elena had been. Elena gasped in pain as she felt the bear's claws rake across her leg. White-hot agony shot through her body. She bit back a scream, knowing that any noise might further provoke the bear. Blood soaked her pants, but she couldn't stop now. Every second counted. The bear, enraged, reared up on her hind legs, towering over Elena. For a split second, Elena stared up at the beast, knowing how close she was to death. She managed to scramble to her feet, clutching her bleeding leg. With every ounce of strength she had left, she stumbled toward the nearest large tree. She had to put something solid between her and the bear. She could feel the animal's hot breath on her back as she threw herself behind the tree trunk, just as the bear slammed into it with a thunderous roar. The impact shook the tree, but it held. For a moment, there was a brief respite. Elena clung to the trunk, gasping for air, blood still pouring from her leg. The bear circled the tree, growling, her claws scraping the bark. Elena knew this wasn't over. The bear was determined, and with no other prey in sight, she wasn't going to leave until Elena was dealt with. With no time to waste, Elena knew she had to retreat to the safety of her research station. Her supplies were limited, and the radio had been damaged in a storm the week before. But it was her only hope. She hobbled as fast as she could, moving through the forest, her vision blurring from the pain and the loss of blood. The bear followed relentlessly, crashing through the undergrowth with terrifying speed. Elena's mind raced. She had to think like a bear, use her knowledge to survive. She angled her path toward the steep ravine that bordered the station, knowing the bear wouldn't follow down such a hazardous drop. As she neared the edge, the sound of the bear's growls grew louder and closer. Finally, she reached the ravine, adrenaline coursing through her veins. She half slid, half fell down the steep incline, wincing as the jagged rocks tore at her skin. The bear stopped at the top, pacing back and forth, growling in frustration but unwilling to follow her down the treacherous path. Elena collapsed at the bottom, her body trembling from shock and exhaustion. She had made it, barely, but the bear wasn't leaving. She watched as it paced along the ridge, still furious, unwilling to abandon its cub, which it still thought was in danger. For hours, Elena remained trapped at the bottom of the ravine, too injured to move, with the bear still nearby. She needed to get back to the station, but with her radio damaged and limited supplies, her options were grim. Her only hope was to wait, to allow time for the bear to calm down, and then find a way to reunite the cub with its mother. Elena had always known the risks of working with wildlife, but now, bleeding and stranded in the wild, she had to use every bit of her knowledge to survive this ordeal. It was a battle between instinct and understanding, and Elena, in her weakened state, knew she was at the mercy of nature. The Wilson family had planned this camping trip in the Adirondacks for months. Mark and Sarah, along with their two young children, Emma and Jacob, had spent countless hours preparing, eager to escape the noise and rush of their suburban lives for a few days in the crisp, quiet wilderness. It was late October, and the Adirondacks were bathed in the golden hues of autumn, with leaves crunching underfoot and the scent of pine and earth thick in the air. For the children, this was an adventure. A weekend of campfires, marshmallows, and sleeping under the stars. Their campsite sat nestled among the towering trees, miles away from the nearest ranger station. The remoteness added to the allure, but it also meant they were on their own if anything went wrong. Still, Mark had always considered himself well-versed in camping. He was confident in their safety, especially after setting up their tent at a distance from where they'd store their food and cook their meals. They had read all the pamphlets about wildlife, and Mark had assured Sarah they'd be fine as long as they followed the rules about food storage. But the Adirondacks were home to creatures that operated under different rules, creatures driven by the unrelenting need to survive, especially as winter loomed. The black bears, normally elusive and uninterested in humans, were in a frenzy of feeding, fattening themselves up for hibernation. Even a whiff of poorly stored food could become an irresistible draw. That afternoon they thoroughly enjoyed themselves. The kids had run through the forest, climbing rocks and collecting leaves, their laughter echoing off the hills. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the air turned colder, Mark lit the campfire, and they roasted hot dogs and marshmallows. The children, exhausted but happy, curled up in their sleeping bags early. Mark and Sarah stayed by the fire a little longer, enjoying the peace that only the wilderness could provide. What Mark didn't realize, however, was that earlier in the day, when he hastily packed away the remnants of lunch, he had left traces of food near the tent, a smear of peanut butter here, a wrapper there. To him, it seemed insignificant, but to a bear preparing for hibernation, it was enough. The first sign of trouble came just after dusk. There was a rustling in the distance, a sound too large to be a raccoon or deer. Mark, standing at the edge of the firelight, peered into the darkness. It was probably nothing, he thought, though a chill of unease settled over him. He dismissed it, returning to the fire and stoking it higher, hoping to ward off the biting cold. Later, as the family settled into their tent for the night, a soft grunt echoed through the trees. It was low and distant, but unmistakable to anyone familiar with the Adirondacks. Sarah's hand tightened on Mark's arm. A black bear. Likely just passing through, he assured himself. though his mind raced. Black bears were generally timid, but it was late in the season, and this one might be more aggressive, desperate to find enough calories to survive the coming months. The snapping of twigs grew louder as the bear drew near to their camp. Mark, heart pounding, slipped on his boots and grabbed a flashlight. Bears were usually scared off by noise or bright lights, but as he stepped outside the tent and shone the beam into the dark forest, he saw nothing. The silence was unnerving, but Mark knew the bear was close. It had picked up the scent of their food. Hidden in the shadows, the bear, a large male over 300 pounds, circled the campsite with eerie stealth. It had already begun to lose its natural caution, drawn by the promise of an easy meal. Suddenly there was a loud crash. The bear had found the food storage, knocking over the cooler. Mark cursed under his breath. Grabbing the air horn from the emergency kit, he blasted it into the night. The bear hesitated briefly, its ears flicking in irritation, but it didn't leave. It was hungry, and fear had given way to determination. The bear loomed just beyond the firelight, a massive dark figure barely visible against the trees. Inside the tent, Sarah clutched their children, Emma and Jacob, trying to calm them while her panic surged. She could hear the bear pawing at their supplies. Mark hurled rocks at the beast, hoping to drive it off, but the bear was undeterred. Its patience was growing thin, and Mark realized the real danger wasn't just in the food. It was in the bear's persistence. Hours passed in tense silence as the bear stalked the campsite, returning after every scare tactic. Mark kept the fire high, praying it would be enough to keep the bear at bay. At one point, the bear brushed against the tent, its massive body pressing against the thin fabric. Inside, Sarah could hear its heavy breathing, just inches from her children. As the night dragged on, Mark's mind raced. Could they run to the car? No, it was too risky. They were miles from help, and escape in the dark was impossible. Their only option was to wait for the morning, hoping the bear would finally retreat. Just as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, a sharp snap echoed through the woods. The bear, startled by the awakening forest, finally turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving the family shaken but alive.